Welcome to the Podcast, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm introducing and interviewing Adam Dymitruk, who's I'll let you explain, Adam, where you're from originally, but you live in Vancouver, and Adam is the inventor of event modeling technique and also, an independent, has his own company of software developers, and they work with clients. So, Adam, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Vaughn. Very happy to be here. Was looking forward to this for a long time. So, I guess a little bit of my background. I'm not originally from Vancouver. I was born in Europe, in Poland, but like most Cold War kids, we ended up in Canada trying to escape the regimes behind the Iron Curtain. So I pretty much consider myself Canadian. I've been here since I was a little boy, and much like yourself, I think we have a few things in common: falling in love with computers at a young age and programming from a very young age. And so I've always had that in my life, and I enjoy it, and I'm happy to continue on running my own company that creates a really nice environment for people that want to do the same. And I'm having fun doing that, especially since adopting some of the things that you're part of, obviously, like domain-driven design and event storming, or what I thought was event storming. More on that later. That's kind of part of the birth of event modeling, which is a unique take on design. So hopefully people will get inspired to try it out and see if it can help them.
One of the earliest references that I have in my mind to you is you were working with Greg Young or collaborating in some way, and I think you learned event sourcing from Greg and maybe CQRS as well. Anyway, could you tell us about your background with event sourcing and CQRS?
Greg changed my life. I needed someone to kind of shake me awake from kind of the ruts in the road, if you will, of development, the type of development that happens. So my history is kind of like most. You kind of end up doing small projects in college, and then straight out of college you do little projects and maybe get a job somewhere, and then eventually you end up in enterprise as you mature more. At least you did in the 90s. It was a much longer path to get into programming back then. Some systems weren't as easy to program, and nor was it easy to find information, and a lot of things were expensive to get experience in enterprise level type of development, telcos or other larger companies. But went through there, kind of got frustrated with some of the amount of money being paid for really what I thought was really easy work when, coming from the 80s, needing to learn assembler and things like this. And I'm getting into middleware and all that kind of stuff. I'm like, people are getting paid how much to do what? So it's kind of, I wanted to get back into something more rigorous. So I got into, obviously, UML and Rational Unified Process, and then Agile, and just always striving to find something to be better. And I spent a long time in Agile. But in 2008, I happened to work across the street from Greg Young, who obviously is the inventor of CQRS. And in fact, I didn't know he was across the street. I went to a meetup in Vancouver and saw him there. And obviously after the meetups, there's a chance to have some beers and talk with people. And so we got chatting, and we figured out that we're working across the street from one another. He was working at Wolverton Securities doing a real-time system for automated trading. And I was at BC Notaries automating some of their property management systems for British Columbia. And so it was quite convenient to have Greg across the street for a year. Not very healthy for my liver, I should say, at that time, because everything was discussed over beer pretty much. But I wouldn't change a thing about it, because we ended up doing quite a lot of talking, and one of the things that he shook me awake from is that you're on the right track with some of the behavior driven design, and specification by example. Here, let me show you an even better way to do that, and that was this a way of getting introduced into event sourcing. But also, even without event sourcing, how about supporting multiple models by separating the read and the write with CQRS? And like, oh, this is wonderful stuff. And I had a lot of questions. So we had, our initial 3 months of beer drinking was basically spent arguing about, well, I can do it anyway this way. And Greg says, no, you can't. What about this? And it was really good back and forth. And I think after the 3 months, I was kind of convinced. It's like, okay, I've exhausted all my arguments from the traditional side. This is a better way, because I'm not just going to jump ship into the next thing I hear about. I want to really challenge it with the knowledge base that I built up about proper software development. And after 3 months, I'm like, okay, Greg, let's go your way, and let's take these things to their extreme and push the envelope to see where it can fall apart, or where we can bring it to the next level. And I think he was trying to build an appliance for what he was doing, literally a physical machine to have a type of event store for event sourcing that you could sell and just ship to a company, saying, here, just put this in your rack, and it'll be this database that you can have as an appliance. So that started the process of him starting the event store project. But there was still some questions about concurrency and all that. And I remember being really proud that one day that I could stump Greg on something, because he knew everything. I mean, he's one of the first people that I saw that really understood debuggers down to the assembler level, going all the way up, and knowing everything about how to talk to business. So really well-rounded, deep knowledge of tech. And I actually got him on the contract across the street because there was some shenanigans going on with a developer not giving up source code. And so we had to reverse engineer stuff, and it got into the SOS debugger. I ended up, it was obfuscated with 9-rays while he was following the debugging trail through whatever he could. I was using Reflector for C#, and I had to change and modify a module to replace Unicode characters, because the obfuscators would not give you good code. They would give you C# that wasn't legal. Class names are the same as namespaces or whatever, things like that. It was still legal intermediate language, but it wasn't something that you could use as code. So I ended up basically redoing the Reflector exporter for dealing with Unicode stuff while he was working on that. But we managed to pull it off and generate a key that wouldn't expire. That developer wasn't smart enough to use asymmetric keys. So we're able to reverse engineer the encryption method to basically implement it backwards to generate a key with an expiry 10 years from now. That allowed the company to continue while the team that I was heading up programmed the replacement. So that's kind of a fun little side story of like just how capable Greg is of doing things on all different levels, and it was really nice. And so back to the main point, I couldn't find anything to stump this guy on. Right, like, where does genius come from? Like, I've never met anyone that was this smart. And then I started to read some papers on concurrency, because that was kind of the right. We were dealing with the right side. It's like, hey, Greg, let's see how we can do similar things that we get in on the right side to scale that out. Because I guess at that time, what was the Amazon thing that was popular for scaling the right side? What's that database? DynamoDB, right? So DynamoDB and all these things are kind of up and coming. And I'm thinking, okay, there's this research paper about Paxos from Leslie Lamport. And so Leslie Lamport didn't really make official papers, but he wrote a lot about this. And there's 20 different flavors of Paxos right now. But it was the first thing that I got him. It's like, how about Paxos? And he said, what's that? It's like, aha, I got you. I got you to say, what's that, for the first time. And it took 6 months. So that was kind of fun. After that year, I think the Toronto Stock Exchange stopped shipping every single order placement in its stream, because they wanted to sell that themselves, I guess. So Wolverton Securities couldn't use that as a money making machine anymore, and I think they were getting bought out by another company anyway. So Greg ended up moving away to Montreal, I believe. But I gained so much insight over that year of working on event sourcing. I built my own event store, and in 2009 started a project that was my first event store that I wrote myself. It was about a page of C# code. It was it's a really simple concept. People tend to think that CQRS and event sourcing is so complicated and all that, and they get lost in infrastructure. When you actually build something from the ground up yourself just to see how it's built, you see how nice and simple and logical it is. And so I think it's a really good exercise for people that are interested in event sourcing and CQRS, just to pick your favorite language. It doesn't really matter. It doesn't have to be C#. It doesn't have to be strictly typed or whatever. Just take the concept and build it yourself. And if you like programming, you'll really enjoy it and really see how if you enjoy it, it'll be fun for you. It's not going to be a tedious thing. So yeah. I really enjoyed it, and I'm quite happy that I think that thing is still in production, because it's simple bit of code that still works. Does just one thing, right? Event sourcing is just storing more files or adding to the same file, yeah. and have a few guarantees of recalling it in order, and some fun with serialization, that sort of stuff.
Yeah, and wow, that could have taken me down like 5 different tangents at least, but let's kind of stay on course. I just wanted to comment on a few things.
Sure.
So I do know that although I never attended Build Stuff when Greg was still involved in Build Stuff, I heard it was nicknamed Drink Stuff.
Oh yes.
And
ouch, so my liver don't even mention it.
Yeah, I'm sort of glad I never showed up there, but so then the other thing is what was it? Yeah, so that's kind of your claim to fame, kind of Paxos with CQRS or event sourcing. Like, why was that a big deal? Was that the consensus for writing shards basically, or partitions?
Yeah, it was a good way to scale out, so have multiple nodes to be able to ingest data. So much like you would shard something or federate for reads. The biggest problem with most scaling systems, typical systems, is the read side. You get way many more reads, people looking at pages and things like that, than you do when you actually want to change state and add something to it. So it's a special concern always scaling the write. But going even back further, when Eric Evans was in Vancouver working for, I think it was Stockhouse, I forget the exact name, and some people were working with him, and getting a large level of ingestion of market data was kind of clunky, and it was multiple instances of SQL databases that then took a range of stock tickers for each one to be able to ingest. But then you had the problem of merging them, and there was always a lag behind that. So scaling the write side is a lot different than scaling the read side. And so you have these compare and swap things that you'll read about if you really dig into the subject. But then also there's a leader election thing. So Paxos kind of has these 3 or 4 actors of agents and voting for who the leader is. And so you always need to have an odd number of nodes, so that voting doesn't end up in what's called split brain. If you have 4 nodes and you have half of them agreeing to one thing and the other half to something else, you'll never get out of it. So it's always this odd number that you want in terms of nodes. And they basically elect a leader. And if you look at Paxos implementations, there's many. And in fact, it's kind of funny because at the same time, Diego, I forget his last name, but he's working on a PhD paper on consensus as well. It was the Raft paper. And so that was kind of happening at the same time. And then when this project with Event Store to scale out the right side was going, James Nugent was working with Greg on that, and he he started to implement Paxos as per kind of what we were talking about back in 2008, but he ended up just making it a lot more efficient. And I mean, there's a lot of flavors of Paxos in terms of this voting stuff. And he ended up coming up by coincidence with something that resembled almost the same thing as Raft. And at Build Stuff in 2016, I believe, Diego was there. And it was kind of funny to see, that two independent areas far away from one another just arrived at the same way of writing these consensus algorithms. So this specific way of doing Raft and Paxos is embedded in the event store project for event sourcing. But that's kind of the long history of that. And Greg always said it's like because of you, Adam, of challenging and bringing to the table the voting mechanisms in Paxos that we kind of have what we have in the event store project. Yeah. I myself didn't really work on it, but was looking at concepts to bring into the fold to have a strategy for making that right side be as consistent as possible for bringing that transactional integrity in an event sourced system.
So I implemented a cluster, our Zoom product clustering, and I found a really cool technique for dealing with the split brain potential for split brain, right? So here's a scenario. What happens if you have a 3-node cluster and you lose the leader? How do you prevent a split brain? Well, first of all, maybe say that one node alone may not be like a healthy cluster, so they have to go into some pause mode or but let's say that you could solve that problem, and instead of arguing over who should be the leader and maybe have a forever loop on voting or something like that between two nodes, you just simply do a lexicographical compare of your identity to the other node's identity. And if that node's identity is lexicographically greater than yours, then you give up your vote of to be the leader, and that node becomes the leader. It's called the bully algorithm because you're actually just saying, okay, I'm bigger than you, sort of, I win. So that solves a lot of problems, and you can retain a quorum of nodes, because 2 is still enough to be a quorum. You do lose some scalability, but chances are good if you're using, for example, Kubernetes to host your nodes, then Kubernetes has possibly even restarted the third node before the other 2 nodes even know that it's gone, right? Like, did it really disappear? Because maybe you have a 5-second, I haven't heard a heartbeat from them for 5 seconds. It could take 1 second to restart, the node. So maybe you don't even know that happens. But if you do, then there's a way to, decide a leader of the quorum.
Yeah, exactly. And you're right on the nose. There's some really simple conventions that you can put into your clusters to have a very common sense way of doing things. Some of the protocols randomize the time interval, add just a little bit of randomness to the timing so that you don't, get some mirroring of behavior that gets stuck in a loop. And, that you can find a lot of these paradigms already in networking protocols and other things. So, once you're in a specific space, things seem a little more mundane after looking at them for a while. So, but at the same time, when you got business objectives, you don't want to be burning your hours on the infrastructure, and you want to be building your features. And so, I got that out of my system to really
absolutely.
play around with that as much as possible, and just fully understand it. That I could, that understanding allowed me to rely on that as my support for building everything on top of it, and that is a database technology that provides me with these guarantees about ordering and persistence that then give me peace of mind when I'm building a system based on an audit trail. The actual log being the state. So with those guarantees, I was happy to then continue to build, and discovered that event sourcing is actually the simplest thing that could work for building systems, because there's nothing simpler than when someone presses a button, the only thing you need to do is store that event. Like that simplicity is overlooked. People get ahead of themselves, seeing that, well, that event will end up in X, Y, and Z. Like, yeah, but that's okay. That's for later. It's the kind of responsible Yagni, if I'm going to steal from Agile, on the architectural level.
Yeah. And then to say, well, maybe just shift gears a little bit. We almost met. I'm trying to think of what year it was, maybe 2010. I think we almost met. I took a long weekend to go attend Greg's event sourcing and CQRS class that he was teaching in Vancouver.
Yeah.
Except, like just before I left on the airplane, he decided not to show up to Vancouver. And so
he was stuck in Montreal
somehow,
back then, I think. Yeah. So it was a lot of flying back and forth. I think he was already in Montreal at that point. Yeah.
Yeah. So what happened is I brought my family, because we were just going to make a week, long weekend of it, and I ended up sitting in my hotel room for 2 days while Greg taught remotely from Montreal. And but we still had a good time. And I think that was like a Thursday and Friday. And then we spent Saturday and Sunday with friends from Bellingham, Washington, up running around Vancouver and going up to see the
Well, you must come back for sure.
Yeah. Well, we've been back. I just have not actually run into you. But if Greg had showed up, we would have met, I think.
Well, I would have
been at that workshop. And, and so we would have met way back then. But anyway, that's funny, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, I ended up getting him to, I was working at Pay by Phone at the time, trying to get DDD to happen there. And as we all do in our careers. And I did bring Greg into that place for consulting, got him in there internally. So he did visit for a number of places that I kind of said, hey, if you have a chance, because in Canada you can get Greg to be here to teach you CQRS from learn it from the guy that came up with it. So back in those days that was quite common for him to fly out and do that. Yeah, it's good. So, I mean, next time, when you're in town, we'll definitely make it work.
Yeah, since we've gotten connected over the past few years, actually, it hasn't been that amiable to travel to Vancouver, but I look forward to when we can do that. And yeah, definitely we'll get together. I did want to ask you something or make a statement. You said that event sourcing is really pretty easy, and I agree with that. It is pretty easy. To me, the difficult part is migration, right? I would just call it, I guess, migrations. But when you have one, let's call it aggregate or entity, I don't care what you call it, but let's say you have an entity.
Oh, I'm quite happy with DDD terms. I love DDD.
Okay, so let's say you have an aggregate, and that aggregate gets split, right? You decide that there are actually two important concepts there, and for whatever reason, you decide to split it. Now you have to deal with splitting the stream that pre-existed to support both new aggregate types. And you have to do that for all instances that ever existed of that original type. Or on the other hand, you decide, these two aggregates should be one because we're always in some kind of a, conflict, like concurrent user conflict kind of thing. And we're crossing each other with use cases. And so we're going to bring this one together so it's transactionally, consistent and only one user can use it at a time.
Yeah.
So how do you, I know that your motto is sort of like, come on, man, use event sourcing. It's simple. And I agree with that. But have you found that challenging to deal with? I guess you've done it so many times that it's like a no brainer to you now, but how should someone view that? How do you solve those problems?
Yeah, it actually came as a realization much later, because one of the things that event sourcing gets sold on is that, hey, you can replay history from the very beginning, so you get all these awesome insights. So it kind of got sold on that thing about, hey, I have this long stream that I can always go back and replay everything. What I realized later, though, is that as we automated systems throughout, centuries or millennia, they worked off of ledger. And what generally happened is in different domains, you had different longevity of individual streams. And actually, there's a proper way to do that. We call it tombstoning, and sometimes for efficiency, it's snapshotting, but I'm not going to conflate the two here. The idea of a tombstone is that an account kind of has an end of life for that entity. And that gives you an opportunity to switch tack and say that, oh, well, from this month on, we're going to think of this single entity as these two separate entities. And we're going to give them we're going to give two initial events for both of those, which may have some state carried over from the previous one, or vice versa. We have these two separate streams, and hey, at the end of the month, we're going to call an end to these shenanigans and put them in as one. And so this is actually evident in information architecture through way before computing. Because, as I'm working with pen and paper back in the old days, I have a filing cabinet beside me. I have an inbox on one side of my desk and an outbox on the other. I fill out my paperwork. I do my job. I get, a pink copy, a canary copy on my form. I put all that into separate boxes on the right side of my desk, and one of them goes into a filing cabinet behind me. Guess what? That filing cabinet's going to get pretty full at the end of the year. So, you see this in banking, at least you did before information was really cheap to store, that, if you wanted something for tax purposes from 2 years ago or something, you paid $30 and you got these ugly scans of whatever the bank used, right? So this kind of the end of life is what was missing with the teachings of the initial years in event sourcing. And I think that's one of the easiest ways to get out of I got the wrong abstraction that I'm using for how I group my events together into an aggregator entity, or whatever language you're using for architecture and talking about entities and transactional boundaries. But yeah, that's kind of how I do it. It's if you have a way to project to a new way, try to not project from all the way from the beginning. It's good as an option for audit purposes, etc. But having kind of a snapshot event to say, hey, this is kind of like my balance from previous month, and now I'm just going to add events just for what happens in this month, and I'll do the same thing at the end of that month.
Yeah,
that's good. And if I need a report, I can link back. I mean, you can embed those IDs in there. There's it's just a simple ID of saying that this came from this old stream and has an ID over there, and you can keep kind of walking backwards like you would in a Git tree, right, in source code. Same idea. But the nice thing is you can also forward link as well, because you can predetermine it's not a hash code of the next thing. So you can predetermine the ID for what the stream will be next month and things like that. So you get a few more options there. And I think when people are doing event sourcing, they forget that they're just automating an information system, and they're trying to go into an extreme way of doing this with saying that this is for continuity, this thing existed forever, and I'm going to be able to say bank account balance is determined by replaying all 7 years worth of transactions. And that's just not the way real systems work, even before computers.
So then for traceability, though, for let's say for compliance, you should point to the old stream, right? So that one event or that snapshot should say this was we've tombstoned this, but this is where our history from that is. This is how I got the snapshot or the start of
the lineage
stream. Yeah, the lineage, the heritage. But so when you tombstone, do you also point forward? It sounds like you could, because if you're already establishing the ID of the future stream that actually doesn't exist yet, then that would be in the tombstone information.
You could, yeah. You could. I mean, there's arguments probably against it. So that what if there's an outage during this little process, and you don't. I guess there is no problem. I guess you could just look at that event and say, "Oh, I forgot that I stopped. I have to generate the new starting ID again." So yeah, I think it works. It's really up to you and what kind of system you're doing. Obviously, projections off of this, you could have some read model that shows you all the mappings of the lineages. I put it somewhere. So that's why I love event sourcing. That you're so free to gain better functionality and better business insights later from this ledger. Greg always said, you don't know what you'll need, next year. And so that's why you keep the events, and you don't have a system that loses information, because you don't know the value of that information. And when you have a simple row in a table that you keep updating, you're essentially deleting the old information there. And that information could be very valuable. As we're learning these days, information's very important and very valuable. So it's kind of nice to have been doing that before kind of people woke up to the power of data analytics and seeing just how powerful data is and valuable it is.
Yeah, cool. So these days, you pretty much do you insist on implementing client projects with event sourcing and CQRS, or do you leave that as an option? Do you sometimes use, I guess, just normal database state records or whatever?
Well, 80% of solutions, even in event source systems, are traditional tables. The big difference, though, is that there's multiple models, which I think is an advantage anyway, because you tend to decouple people's effort. I can work on one screen, you can work on another. We both have our own read models that populate that data. They use the single source of truth, which is a stream of what happened. So there's still coupling. Obviously, you can go back and say that we're coupled by the fact that we may listen to the same event. But in terms of concurrency of work effort, it's incredibly powerful to be able to parallelize more because you're supporting multiple models. It's kind of implied when you're doing event sourcing of that. So to answer the question, yeah, we only do event source systems because it's actually cheaper and faster. People say, this is again my argument that event sourcing and CQRS is more expensive and all that. You're basically looking at symptoms of baby duck syndrome and other things. People that just are trying to force old paradigms onto a new way of working. But the way we work, everyone understands how to do event sourcing. They understand the benefits of event sourcing. They understand the benefits of multiple models, and so yeah, by default, we always do that. And keeping an event stream around and having multiple projections is kind of keeping things pure with full accountability. You can, of course, collapse that and say, hey, let's take these read models and normalize them into one set of tables, because I don't want to repeat this information about the user 10 times. So I'm going to make a user table and have it in one, because I'm going to do dry right on the data architecture side and save some disk space. But now you've coupled everyone. Now if I'm doing 3 screens that have user information in there, and I have 3 developers working at the same time on those 3 screens, they're constantly walking on eggshells around one another, not daring to touch that table. Right? I don't want that. It's not a good way to work. So we always default to that. I kind of draw the analogy. It's hard to unboil an egg. Once you normalize something and add a ton of coupling because you're saving space and not repeating yourself, that coupling is like the egg whites congealing to a white solid mass, and it's hard to unboil an egg, right?
Sure.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe though, one thing that you said that if I understood you correctly, you said everybody understands event sourcing. I don't know. Maybe you mean everybody
at our
at AdaptTech. Everybody
That's
at
what I meant. Sorry.
AdaptTech. Yeah.
Pretty
So
much. I mean,
danger
and they
there.
learn quickly if they're new. Yeah.
So, and by the way, AdaptTech is Adam's company in Vancouver. But yeah, so here's the thing, right? I'm going to say it was probably 6 years ago, we started to hear backlash about event sourcing, and we heard backlash about CQRS. And strangely enough, CQRS has been conflated as meaning event sourcing, or at least, like someone will say, we're using CQRS, and then they start talking about their event store. And it's like, well, you realize those are two different things. And
I think that people did conflate the two. Yeah.
But then someone, starts throwing event sourcing under the bus, and they're blaming event sourcing for a failure of their project. And then they point at their blog post that explains all this. And you go to the blog post, and as you read, you go, this person literally did not understand how to use event sourcing. And they blew it for the company. Maybe they just did it because they thought they understood, but no wonder they failed. Literally, I've read multiple of those cases, and I think you can go to Reddit and see
absolutely.
those.
A lot of
Combinator or whatever. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I totally agree with you. And I think there's many factors at play as to why that happened. There's obviously the building up your CV with buzzwords, and someone actually thought that they would get their career by making sure that, hey, ES is something that's really good, and this is how large companies scale. We got some presentations from Netflix about CQRS and things like that. So hey, let's do this in our company, and then you get the whole thing about was it cargo culting and all that kind of stuff. But the motivations of the people, et cetera, and whether you have the culture that wants to change, because, essentially, CQRS and event sourcing are tied together, but not in a bi-directional way. I think if you're doing event sourcing, you implicitly are doing CQRS because you're going to have projections of state, whether you make those permanent as tables or whether it's just a calculation by going over the events. There's the concept of projecting state off of the event store, and that gives you the read-write side of the architecture anyway. But CQRS does not need event sourcing. You could certainly have some OOP type objects sitting there as being the source of truth, and then you publish events as to what happened to that object. You're not reading them. You're just using this as a publishing mechanism. You're not storing them. That's not how state is. You can actually serialize that object and put it on disk and overwrite it in a key value store or something. But the event of like, hey, this thing happened to my object gets published, and 3 or 4 read models or projections kind of listen to that, and then 3 or 4 screens can show different interpretations of that same information, build up their own state of what that is. So I see CQRS as implied and there as part of event sourcing, even if you don't make it, some stereotypical implementation that has a materialized read model. I think conceptually that same logic would go into whatever would persist that data in a table that you just do, as you're reading. And in fact, I start a lot of event sourcing projects just like that. So, like, there's no read models. I'm just going to iterate through all events at the very beginning, and I'll just develop the read side as an optimization when there's too many events and replaying all of them doesn't make sense anymore. But I realize that it's the exact same code, and the refactoring to do that is almost free. It's not expensive at all. So, and that's why I like event sourcing as the simplest thing I could work, because I'm done with the database and persistence. When someone presses that button, user registered, I have a JSON serialized string that sits there on disk with a timestamp, and that's all I need.
Cool. And I agree, it's very useful. Although if I insisted on using event sourcing for everything, I probably wouldn't have as many clients as I've had.
I know. I have that problem.
And I think that part of that is because some people are well known for event sourcing and CQRS, and so they're kind of sought out when that is the desired, patterns to use. I am sought out for DDD and not that, like my name is not closely associated with those, even though I've used them extensively, and even built, our Zoom platform, to support both of those. It's it's not something that I'm kind of married to. So, but it's cool that you can choose.
Well, there's another type of client, Vaughn, that's that doesn't have an IT department of their own. They don't have programmers of their own that don't care what you do to build their system. And they're actually the easiest clients because they're like, oh, you mean I'll get all the information all the time? Like, of course, why isn't everyone doing that, right? When you talk to business people about event sourcing, you're like, duh, why isn't everyone doing this?
Yeah. And there are very successful companies that fall into that. Like they just can't justify having an IT department and a software development team, even one software developer. So they don't. And then they use a lot of packaged software, but sometimes they do need to differentiate and have some,
Well, that's an expensive thing to do, though, to get an IT department, and talent is not easy to come by. People demand a high rate of pay. So we've noticed that a lot of, especially startups, they've been delaying getting an IT department and getting developers simply because, from us, they get each state transition and each, projection for a fixed price, and we guarantee it to work. So they're like, okay, well, do I hire someone for $100,000, or do I just get these next features for $50,000 and Adaptec will guarantee that they work forever? Like, that's a pretty easy choice. So like, okay, well, if we get the feature, we can put off, hiring a developer for another year because we're getting the functionality we need and they'll support it. So it's kind of a nervous thing, especially with startups, because a lot of startups, they want an exit strategy and they have to be structured a certain way, meaning they have to have an IT department, they have the proper management structure, blah, blah, blah. And all the checkboxes are green. This is a proper tech company. Please buy us for $10 million or $100 million or whatever. So there's that fine, weird edge that we're at right now where people don't trust that someone can outsource something, because there's horrible stories of outsourcing where people get milked for money because they're by the hour and their things are 90% done, 95%. You hear the horror stories, right?
Yeah.
So we challenge that head on. It's like, look, it's fixed cost. We'll fix everything for free, as long as you're doing event modeling and showing exactly what each screen does and all that.
Yeah. There is a significant number of companies that fall into that category. And by the way, it's no longer buy us for 10 million or 100 million. It's buy us for 10 billion. Now,
I know.
That's the secret number, at least 10 billion, right? But anyway, times have changed. Although I read some news yesterday. So right now we're at the longest day of the year. Is that correct? Or, no,
not yet. 21st.
So we're
almost.
What date are we? I've completely forgotten. I guess that Andreessen Horowitz, like within the past few days, scaled down to literally Andreessen and Horowitz, right? Those are the two people remaining in that company. Yeah. And I've heard that it's those who are very heavily invested in crypto. So crypto is taking that dive that rational thinkers, always sort of knew would happen. Not that crypto's dead by any means yet, but
it's another .com, right? We had this with .com too.
But it's sort of it's like the .com thing, and it may even survive, but it has hurt enough companies that those $10 billion startups are becoming a unicorn when you have a 1.0 product, right? Is just fascinating to me, that because if you really look at the value of the company based on revenues, it's nowhere near worth
of course.
$1 billion.
That's
And
what,
I mean,
what could be.
yeah.
I mean,
yeah. So
you have traffic and user counts being inflated for valuations instead of actual revenue, of course. Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, but it's interesting that I think that's going to be hard to raise money for those kinds of companies coming up here. But we digress a bit. I really want to talk.
I'm glad that you brought it up, because it does impact our business, and it does loop back to event sourcing, because event sourcing kind of gave rise to event modeling, but event modeling can be used for non-event source systems if you want. But for our case, it does. And, if you're a startup and then all of a sudden you can't have the middle of your management triangle because middle management is incredibly expensive, and you want to be able to just connect the idea people and the business people to the actual people, the people that are going to be building things, without having a whole mass of workers in between doing management things. When there is a recession, middle management's the first to go for a reason. So we actually do quite well during hard times. We actually had a lot more business during COVID, et cetera, because people don't have 10 project managers to take care of the projects. They now have one. And so event modeling really makes them highly effective, so that the one project manager, if they understand event modeling, can do the job of 10. And that actually helps companies quite a bit. So we always see, when the times are good, people can spend money on project managers and other management positions. And there's a lot of established practices there that kind of don't allow you to do new things, honestly, because the industry hasn't moved to event modeling and event sourcing as the default. And so the companies that do stick their neck out and do things this way, they have an advantage. But as the times get tough, they look for, hey, I can't hire some sketchy company overseas to throw money away at, and they'll just milk me until I'm dead.
Yeah.
They want a fixed cost. They want transparency. And I think doing this by event is natural, and people understand. They see that we're going to have, 50 screens, and we're going to have, 40 different events that kind of correlate to each state transition. And hey, these guys have a fixed cost for each of those, and they guarantee it. So I'm hoping that more companies work this way. I'm here just to kind of show as an example. For 7 years, we've been doing it only this way, and we're still alive and thriving through ups and downs in the economy. Yeah, event sourcing is awesome. And you can certainly succeed much better than in traditional stuff. But like anyone pushing the envelope, it's a rough ride. You're going to have people sticking their feet out to trip you.
Well, I just wanted to say that that's a perfect segue, because you started mentioning event modeling. So we're going to talk about that. Tell us about event modeling. How did it get started? And what is this, sort of secret weapon about it?
Yeah, it's kind of throwing your hands in the air that I give up on design from a specific perspective. I kind of give up on trying to show abstractions and other concepts. The only design that I'm going to listen to is one that allows all roles to participate, and that's information architecture. I call it that. It's really about looking at workflows and where information flows to, the shape of the information, because everyone can agree on what that is. You're not going to talk to a business person about the fact that you have a class person and employee inherits from that class. You lost them. Like, that's just not going to happen, right? So you can say, hey, I'm signing up a user. Here's an event that captures the user. Oh, and they ticked the box for reseller. So I don't have to have a reseller inherits user. I can say that there's an event that this user registered as a reseller. And so when I'm talking about these types of things, now people understand some of the architecture and design of a system with layman's terms, which sort of allows a system to be described to everyone. And event modeling really is, I thought it was event storming, which is yours and Alberto's kind of baby. I think you came
Well,
up with it first, I believe.
Yeah, it's
I
Alberto's
forget the
baby.
history.
I won't. What I did is I invited Alberto to teach a day with me in Europe during what I called the IDD tour, and he introduced what became event storming. I thought it was called event storming back then, but I think he said it had a different name. I can't remember, but yeah. So,
well, anyway,
I did sort of facilitate, the introduction of it, but it's all his. So.
Yeah. So this actually has a longer history, because when I was working with Greg in 2008, what he was doing is he was putting sticky notes on the whiteboard for a sequence of events to talk about a scenario that existed in the market that he was going to automate and put in an order of a certain size to run that business. And so this idea of by example events, because we have specification by example, but it's kind of done with DSLs, and it's kind of up in the air as to what level of abstraction you want to do that at. Is it just subcutaneous, or is it at the individual class level storytelling? Events transcend those layers. They basically say that I can focus on whatever level I need, but they're all kind of spelled out. This event happened, this event happened. User registered, user signed up for reseller, user, whatever it is, you have a story there. And so that was quite neat. And it kind of became a core way of me doing specification by example. If I use event sourcing by default, the DSLs, the mock objects, the frameworks for BDD, they all fall away. I can do it with sticky notes or anything else, and I can say that this is an example of how this workflow happens. And then, like, hey, I can put these in different streams, in different swim lanes horizontally across timelines. Say, by example, this is how these two systems interact. And it really was born from this idea of building systems on events. But as I was starting the company, we didn't really have projects, and we promised that we'll do everything. So that meant we have to do project management, we have to do product ownership a lot of times, or at least interact with product owners. We need to do bug tracking and, track progress and all that. So, but we didn't have kind of the budget to bring in all those roles, bring in all those tools. And so we started building on this event stream. What else do we need? Oh, these guys need to know what the screens will look like. Okay, well, let's maybe just put those above there, because we can show what screens happen as these events are happening underneath. It's like, okay, well, how do these events get in? Of course, we're doing CQRS and event sourcing, but then what danger is that to show the customer that there's commands? Well, there isn't any. Like, whenever they press a button, there's a blue thing that pops up, and that ends up as an event. And then, when there's a screen shown with some information, hey, that's a green box, from event storming. Now I kind of thought I was doing event storming, so we're borrowing from that. And say, hey, this is an event storming session. But of course, there wasn't no UI in event storming at that time, and things like that. So we're really doing a map of information flow, visually and analytically, right? The events were analytical. You could look at the information underneath, and we do this check called information completeness check, which the CTO from Event Store, Chris Condren, really loves, because there was a big project that was saved by this aspect of it, is that you can follow and trace information all the way through a beginning of a workflow to the end of a workflow. Make sure that you're not making stuff up along the way. You're not missing requirements where information comes from. So event modeling ended up being the thing that replaced all practices for us, so that we could just be, at the beginning it was the CTO, Nicola, and myself, working on really complex large systems, just two people. And how are we able to provide progress reports, interact with designers, product owners, and architects, and all of those things through a very limited amount of budget and time. So It was high altitude training of trying to do things that basically said, hey, we have a blueprint that's kind of like when you're building a house. You have a table in the corner of the property. That's a large table where you roll out the blueprint, and there the electrician and the plumber and the carpenter and everyone can look at and see where they're at, how they integrate together, and build the house. And they can go to that all the time. So We didn't have time for stand-ups. Like, why would we have a stand-up? We actually have the design here. I know what the next part is that I need to to build. And this whole event model ends up getting sliced up into vertical slices. So each part of this event model slice encapsulates the full stack. So whatever technology you're using to show the UI, whatever you're doing to make the calls, the REST calls to the API on the back end, whatever you're storing in a database or the event store, that's all included. It's really a full stack implementation of a workflow. So it's almost as if we embraced the concept of workflow as being the core thing that everyone could understand and see what the system actually does. And so event modeling became, I think I finally wrote about it after going to Alberto's summit in 2018. He invited me because this was all it was called event storming. We thought we were doing event storming. So he invited me there. And when everyone's talking about stuff, it's like, well, wait a second, you have all these things up in the air. We do event storming properly. Look, we see what screens are there. We see what data is there. It's like, no, that's not event storming. And okay, well, I guess it's not. Kind of got a lesson in event storming from all the top practitioners and Alberto himself in Italy. So I said, okay, well, I can't call it event storming because it isn't. And so on the plane back, I actually wrote the big article and came up with event modeling, and that ended up being the top story on Hacker News back in fall of 2018 when I published it. So that's kind of cool.
Yeah, and I just want to say that from what I can see, the biggest differentiation between event storming and event modeling is that event modeling is very scenario based. Could I get just a yes or no answer?
Of course.
So would you say that by using event modeling, you actually do not need user stories or other kinds of sort of written scenarios like,
yes.
Gherkin or whatever?
Yes, you don't need it.
So you don't need it.
You can certainly map those two, and if you are already using those things, I have a whole bunch of talks, and part of the book that I'm writing is also how event modeling maps to what you're used to, because we need to have that bridge built between someone making the transition or having to deal with clients that are still using Jira, they're still using user stories, they're still using all of these things. How do you represent that in an event model? Is there an automated way to represent to a traditional client things as written user stories? And that's certainly possible. As long as certain conventions are there.
Yeah. So but I want to make the point. I don't even remember if I said this, and I need to. That to me, event storming is not naturally scenario based. I have actually, for a long time, been using event storming. So we go into this big picture, right? But then to actually understand how, in the design level, to implement, I do basically scenarios, timelines, right? And so I will have multiple scenario timelines. I will not have a single, like just one timeline of a design level model. Because like you said, you need the scenarios. You need to know what happens when the user clicks this, right?
Yeah, exactly. So, and there's a natural way of the two to work together. We actually found a lot of teams that use event storming and then switch to event modeling to get to implementation. I think a lot of people were stuck at the conceptual level with event storming for a while. I know Alberto's added 2 more forms since then for event storming to kind of go down that route and design entities and things like that with event storming. But certainly in terms of the certain things that we have is no branching, because that, by example, the information completeness, the minute you start adding branching into the diagram, you lose the story, you lose the communication, you lose the simple interrogation of whether you're correct for state. And so that ends up helping quite a bit. So we see quite a few people using event storming to start, and then when they're ready to get on with implementation, they switch to event modeling, and they can just copy the events and use them.
Cool. I guess you understand the NFL.
Yeah, the timeout, Adam. You've been talking too long.
Well, I hate to do this. I have actually never been scheduled up against for a podcast up against a client session, so I really have to run. But here's the thing, right? You're working on a book, as you said.
Yeah.
I think we've agreed that you're gonna allow me to have your book in my signature series.
I would love for it to be in the series. Absolutely. Okay, I think it belongs there.
So we have that to look forward to, and I'm really certain that it will get approved for publish whenever you're ready to introduce that. So a lot of good things to look forward to. Let's actually just schedule another podcast in 6 or 9 months or something. We'll carry on. Absolutely. From whenever you have time. Maybe we can do it in Vancouver by then or something. So,
it would be lovely to have you visit and meet with all of our folks that continue to practice event sourcing, CQRS, and DDD.
I have 30 seconds to get. Thanks, Adam, for joining us. It was a lot of fun.
My pleasure. Okay. Thank you for having me. Always good to chat.
Take care.
Take care. Bye-bye.